everyone, my name is Farzan Sibet. I am a managing researcher at the Sanctions and Systematic Peace Hub of the Geneva Graduate Institute. I go by IranWonk on Substack and X. I haven't posted here in a while because I've been incredibly busy with work. During the 12-day Iran-Israel war, I probably did something like 24 media interviews, podcasts, and events, and I look forward to posting those in the coming days and weeks. In the meantime, I just wanted to do a reaction to the Tucker Carlson interview with Masood Pezeshkian, the president of the Islamic Republic. Apologies for the low quality of the video, but I'm working under incredible time and technical constraints. So I want to give a quick backdrop to the Carlson-Pezeshkian interview. My understanding is that it's at a minimum the third attempt by somebody inside the Islamic Republic to do an interview with Tucker Carlson, or even potentially bring him into Iran. The first attempt happened during the government of President Ibrahim Raisi and was led, I understand, by a hardline figure associated with the kind of principlist academic think tank complex, somebody who appears frequently in the English-speaking media, mainly in the alternative media space. That effort, as far as I'm aware, was blocked by Iran's security services, potentially the Revolutionary Guard. The second attempt happened after the election of U.S. President Donald Trump late last year and was led by a very senior former figure in Iran's foreign policy establishment. That second effort, as far as I'm aware, was actually blocked by another senior figure, serving figure within the foreign policy establishment. And of course, the third attempt was driven by a desire by the foreign ministry, and specifically the foreign minister of the Islamic Republic, Azad, to have such an interview ahead of prospective talks with U.S. Middle East Special Envoy Steve Witkoff in order to create, I guess, a more positive atmosphere around those talks. The idea being that Tucker Carlson, representing the, let's say, anti-interventionist, conservative wing of the MAGA movement, would have President Trump's ear and, again, would help create a good atmosphere around these talks. And, of course, my understanding is that the proposal then was to maybe have an initial lengthy interview, up to 2 hours, with Foreign Minister Arakchi, and then that could be followed potentially by a visit by Tucker Carlson to Iran itself and an interview with Masood Pezeshkian. That, of course, didn't happen. My understanding was that the Iranian side was very slow, and ultimately Carlson's camp backed off. But of course, following the 12-day Iran-Israel war, there was a renewed interest in having such an interview. My understanding is that, well, it probably, from the perspective of the Islamic Republic, would have been better to have Arakchi do the interview, because he does speak English and is much more fluent in the issues and can probably better speak to American audiences. Ultimately, the Carlson camp probably thought that President Pezeshkian was a better get. In my view, I think this would have been more effective from a diplomatic perspective if it had been done ahead of the first round of talks. Of course, it doesn't mean that there's no value for it to happen now, at least from the Islamic Republic's perspective. I think one of the most significant aspects, probably the most significant, is that the interview happened rather than much of the specific content of the interview. I don't think it was particularly groundbreaking. And again, this is because Tucker represents the kind of a non-interventionist or anti-interventionist conservative wing of the MAGA movement. It's, the Islamic Republic historically has not been good at establishing a dialogue with the Republican Party or the, let's say, conservative establishment. And so this is a step in that direction, and in my view, breaks a taboo, especially given the seniority of Tucker, his place within U.S. politics and the media space. But again, I didn't find the contents of the interview to be particularly groundbreaking. And of course, many coming from different perspectives are going to find this interview underwhelming or perhaps disappointing, and that's because Tucker represents a very specific perspective. And so, given the limited time that he was probably allotted, more than Iranian presidents usually give Western and especially American media outlets, but still constrained amount of time, focused on the questions that he thought was probably most important and relevant to members of kind of the interventionist conservative base of the MAGA movement. So there's maybe a half dozen or so specific points regarding the 12-day war itself and the future of U.S.-Iran nuclear negotiations that I thought it was interesting to highlight, despite the fact that, again, the content was underwhelming. Probably the most significant, the most interesting novel point to come out of the actual interview, and it's been widely covered by the Western media as well as the regional media, is that President Pezeshkian confirms that Israel did in fact attempt to assassinate him. And Tucker Carlson comes back to this point. He actually asks him about this twice, and President Pezeshkian then goes into detail about how that assassination attempt could have unfolded, and it appears fairly credible to me. We'll come back to why that's potentially significant later on. I think a second important point is actually something that Tucker says at the very beginning of the interview, which is that he correctly identifies the state of the conflict as it stands now as a pause rather than some type of a permanent or long-lasting ceasefire in the conflict. Again, something we'll come back to when kind of summarizing and looking to the future of both talks and the Iran-Israel conflict. The third interesting point was that President Pezeshkian said that, of course, Iran stands ready to have oversight of the nuclear program, but has lost access to many nuclear facilities due to the damage done to those facilities by Israel's attacks. And I think this is probably a narrative that we'll see the Islamic Republic repeat as a basis for not permitting access to its nuclear program. And in many cases, it might be correct, right? The Islamic Republic itself might have lost access to those facilities. It has to go in there and evaluate what's happened, and perhaps either for political or technical or safety reasons, it won't be able to give international inspectors access to those facilities. How valid it is factually, regardless of that, again, it's probably a line that you're going to see come up again. The third point, which Tucker asked about, and I thought was interesting, was lack of trust in the IAEA. He asked for specific evidence that the IAEA had transferred intelligence regarding Iran's nuclear program to Israel. It's completely plausible that happened. It's probably more likely to me that Israel was giving intelligence to nuclear inspectors and to the IAEA, that their relationship mostly worked the other way around. But again, it's something might be a valid critique on the part of the Islamic Republic, and something that will probably come up again. But interestingly, rather than presenting evidence of what the IAEA did to provide intelligence to Israel, Pezeshkian focused on two things. One was to blame the IAEA report ahead of Israel's attack for preparing the ground for the attack. Whether this was a deliberate by the IAEA, I haven't seen evidence that it was deliberate on their part. It's probably true that it could have at least informed the timing of Israel's attack, right? And the second, of course, was to say that afterwards the IAEA failed to sufficiently condemn the attack on Iran and its nuclear facilities. And of course, this will probably be a sticking point and a thorn in the side of Iran-IAEA relationships moving forward. Not to say that they're irreparable, but significant damage has been done. Another point that I thought was important to highlight from the interview was that Pezeshkian did not place blame for the war or the failed talks on President Trump, but Netanyahu. And of course, this to me signals Iran's continued openness, the Islamic Republic's continued openness, to negotiate with the U.S. And of course, the kind of framing was that, it's either we negotiate and reach peace, or President Trump continues on this current course, Israel continues on its current course, and we're in a kind of perpetual state of for forever war, right? I think that specific phrasing was probably intended to kind of appeal to President Trump himself and the MAGA base, of course, which partly at least elected President Trump to pull the U.S. out of so-called forever wars, especially in West Asia and North Africa, the Middle East. And it seemed to me that President Pezeshkian then set kind of a condition for return to talks, which was for President Trump to prevent or give a red light to future Israeli attacks on Iran, especially while talks are happening. And a final point that I thought was significant was that the Pezeshkian left open the possibility and the option for the U.S. to trade and invest in Iran and to do business with Iran. And of course, this is probably another factor that was raised and intended to appeal to President Trump personally. Next, I want to address the Carlson-Pezeshkian interview as an act of foreign policy communication. To put it bluntly, I don't think Masood Pezeshkian is a good political communicator, let alone a good foreign policy communicator. One can imagine past Iranian presidents like Mohammad Khatami, like Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, like Hassan Rouhani, being more effective communicators, being better foreign policy communicators, being more charismatic comparatively, right? But Pezeshkian in the interview spoke in a very stilted, very formal language filled with, let's say, religious and revolutionary overtones that makes sense maybe in the narrow confines of the mindset of the Islamic Republic, but is not very appealing more broadly inside of Iran, let alone to an audience of President Trump and the American public, especially the MAGA base. And of course, this is because the supreme leader of the Islamic Revolution, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, as he's consolidated power over time, has clipped the wings of Iranian presidents to make them even weaker actors within the Islamic Republic system than they have been in the past. And this became very prominent with a figure like Ibrahim Raisi, who was an incredibly weak, uncharismatic person, and of course a very poor administrator. Masood Pezeshkian is probably a step up compared to him, but still a fairly weak figure and an uncharismatic figure. And of course, in doing this interview, in many instances, he wasn't even able to answer Tucker Carlson's questions. Just again, not necessarily to give a satisfying answer for him, but to answer it in the way that would allow Tucker to move forward. And you could see in one or two points Tucker was a little bit frustrated and came back to some questions and pressed him on it because he is generally a poor communicator. This isn't necessarily Pezeshkian's fault in the sense that my understanding is that the foreign ministry wanted Arakchi to do this interview originally, and that they were pressed by Tucker to put forward the president. Of course, the Islamic Republic felt compelled because they thought perhaps that this interview could be important to put out a message and to create a better atmosphere, both around possible future negotiations, both in terms of maintaining the so-called ceasefire, and of course during a particular moment when Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was visiting D.C., and so to perhaps influence President Trump at a time when he might be pressed to take stronger actions diplomatically on the economic front, of course on the military front against the Islamic Republic. And of course, one of the things that was quite remarkable from a foreign policy communication perspective was, for example, the question about death to America and the hostility of the Islamic Republic towards the U.S. And of course, Pezeshkian rightly said that the Iranian people don't necessarily hold such a grudge. And he went further to kind of say that death to America means death to crimes, and kind of death to negative actions, not necessarily death to officials or people. And this, of course, was immediately undermined, and Tucker did raise this, by statements of senior Iranian officials themselves, right? Such as Ayatollah Ahmed Khatami, who in the past, has led Friday prayers in Tehran and is a senior clergyman, a senior member of the Council of Guardians, a very important body in the Islamic Republic system, and a senior member of the Assembly of Experts. In a recent speech just days ago, made threats basically against U.S. President Trump and others, and the crowd that he was speaking to chanted "Death to America" and I believe "Death to England." And of course, the Islamic Republic could do this and sort of get away with it in the past, right? Communicate one way with foreign audiences to give one visage and one appearance, and communicate another way to the hardline elite and social base of the system to keep them satisfied. But these contradictions, which also reflects the dispersed nature of power somewhat in the Islamic Republic system itself, and the inability to coordinate and reach strong decisions, those decisions are then advanced comprehensively across the system by all the actors. This reflects that it undermines Iran's foreign policy messaging in a very serious way, right? It of course makes the Islamic Republic look deceitful, which of course it is, but lying in international relations is like drinking water. It's a very, very common act. And of course, this contradiction is just less effective, right? When somebody like a President Trump sees this or hears this, right? It does make the Islamic Republic appear more disingenuous, and it decreases its overall ability to communicate its points and to have a dialogue with President Trump. In the past, the Islamic Republic could communicate in its own way, which was very kind of inward-looking, both to certain domestic audiences as well as certain audiences in the region linked with the acts of resistance. I think that mode of communication just doesn't work anymore. And if the Islamic Republic does want to have successful communication with President Trump, it has to learn to communicate with him and with American audiences, with American foreign policy elites, much more on their terms. That's at least my belief. And yeah, so that's just some thoughts on, let's say, the foreign policy communication and symbolic dimensions of the interview. I want to end with a few preliminary conclusions on the interview and possible implications moving forward. Again, I think that the interview happened was more significant than its specific content, although there were some interesting tidbits, and we can kind of see how those threads will play out. I think it was really a missed opportunity to communicate with President Trump and the American people, but of course, I think that's a characteristic overall of the Islamic Republic system, which is not very nimble and able to act on these types of opportunities. So after months, even years of trying to get establish some kind of relationship with Tucker Carlson and have an interview to communicate directly with President Trump and the MAGA base, the Islamic Republic ultimately wasn't able to really capitalize on it, although it could be a stepping stone to further acts of foreign policy communication. And one prominent thing I've seen, which I think is a very important signal to me, is that the Islamic Republic continues to try to go around the Israel issue, both in U.S.-Iran relations and its own foreign policy in the region. He specifically, President Pezeshkian, in talking about President Trump's options moving forward and dialogue and negotiations with Iran, mentioned that the U.S. And President Trump in particular should put Israel in its place. Not understanding that much of the Islamic Republic's foreign policy initiatives since the death of the founder of the Islamic Republic, the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, since the end of the Cold War, since the 1990s, many of the Islamic Republic's initiatives to reach a détente with the U.S. and to have some kind of normalization with it in foreign policy have essentially failed over the Israel factor in U.S. politics, whether it's domestic politics or foreign policy, usually both, and of course failed in terms of confronting Israel as a major power in West Asia and North Africa, which has effectively blocked U.S.-Iran detente and normalization. And this continues to be mindset. They continue to believe, the Islamic Republic does, that it can go around Israel, communicate directly with the U.S., very poorly, but still, and reach some kind of compromise without dealing with the Israel issue. And, it's very possible that, like President Barack Obama, U.S. President Trump will be able to put the Israel factor and the Israel issue in a box and make a separate deal with Iran, with the Islamic Republic. And maybe will even act to constrain Prime Minister Netanyahu in Israel. Of course, based on everything we've seen about President Trump since 2017, when he first came to power during his first term, it seems very unlikely to me. And even when that approach somewhat succeeded under President Obama, we saw that it returned and was an important factor, important driver in undoing the Iran nuclear deal, or the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. And so it seems to me that the Islamic Republic really isn't ready or willing to confront this issue, and the need to probably reach some kind of arrangement with Israel that changes that status quo and opens up new possibilities for its domestic and foreign politics. And as long as that's the case, I don't see its diplomacy being particularly successful. And so this brings us, I guess, to where I think we are in the U.S.-Iran conflict and U.S.-Israel conflict, which is that it's a scenario pinned at the top of my X account, IranWonk, called Unstable Equilibrium, which means that, of course, the Islamic Republic probably for the foreseeable future will not be ready to capitulate, and it will resist in the interim. And not finding a diplomatic off-ramp, of course, will see the conflict continue, with Israel shifting to a so-called campaign between wars, or mowing the lawn mode, such as we've seen in Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, where it conducts either covert or overt strikes on Iran's attempt to rebuild its missile and nuclear capacities, and goes even further. And I agree with Carlson's framing of the current ceasefire as more of a pause rather than a true ceasefire that can lead to some kind of end to the conflict. And my sense is probably, whereas the first phase of Israel's attack focused more on disrupting Iran's military response function by killing senior military leaders, whereas it focused on degrading Iran's air defenses and standoff weapon offensive capabilities, its missile and drone capabilities, and striking the industries behind that, and of course, striking at Iran's nuclear program and nuclear infrastructure to set back the time frame during which the Islamic Republic would be able to break out to a nuclear bomb if it chose to do so. So whereas the initial logic of the strike seems to have been more military and more nuclear, and to buy further time and space for Israel regarding kind of the challenge it faces from the Islamic Republic, subsequent phases could have more of a focus on destabilizing the Islamic Republic. And so that could include attempts to decapitate the senior political leadership. And as we saw, it appears they tried that with Pezeshkian. They didn't succeed. That tells me part of the reason for ending the last round was because they couldn't succeed in terms of those goals. And so that could be a factor in a subsequent system destabilization phase, second phase of an Israeli military campaign. And of course, potentially even striking at domestic security targets and major economic targets so as to disrupt the system. So I think, what this interview showed me is that the Islamic Republic is not ready to take the type of steps that would conclusively allow diplomacy to succeed and allow the conflict to end. And so that this conflict is likely to continue. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next week, maybe not in a month. But I would expect further flare-ups in the coming year. And more broadly, they don't really seem to have understood, at least from what we can see publicly, President Trump's mindset. My kind of thinking when President Trump was elected was that they need to go big, move fast, or go home. Go to Mar-a-Lago, make a quick deal that would appeal to President Trump, and put this conflict on ice and work out the details later, perhaps with the assistance of the Europeans and others. They still don't seem to be ready to do something like that and to make the type of changes that would be necessary to reach a sustainable end to the conflict and reach a sustainable deal. And so I think that's where we stand today. Final point I want to highlight is that the interview was facilitated by a small media startup called the Azad Institution, which, as I understand, has been working for a decade or so, founded by alumni of Sharif University of Technology. But subsequently, in the last few years, it's become a YouTube channel with a Patreon and is available on other social media platforms, and has really become a space to host debates. Initially, they believe they started with philosophical debates, and they've moved forward to holding broader domestic politics, foreign policy, economic, social debates inside of Iran, and in my view, really pushing the boundaries of freedom of speech. Now, there's been, I think, mostly the response to their role in facilitating this interview has been positive. There is some backlash against them, accusing of being, agents of the Islamic Republic or a project of the Islamic Republic's intelligence services. Iran is a fairly low-trust society, or has become increasingly low-trust over time. Anything is possible. In watching them for the last few years on YouTube and interacting with them, my sense is that they're fairly earnest, that they approach a lot of these questions with an open mind, and that they're really trying to push the boundaries of debate and what's possible in Iran. And what's very remarkable for me is that this tiny media startup with very small resources, very low number of personnel, less than 10, I believe, less than a dozen, working out of a small apartment studio with minimum equipment, for which they've been hassled by the authorities in the Islamic Republic, and on a shoestring budget, managed to put together a type of interview which the entire foreign policy and massive multi-billion-dollar media complex of the Islamic Republic has not been able to. I'm not against planism or some forms of state-led development, especially in the global south, where perhaps that's needed more. But it truly shows the weakness and the inefficacy of the Islamic Republic as a system. This was not something that it was able to do in all this time by itself, and especially its media complex, which is a basis for corruption, for rentierism, and a way for the system in Iran to dole out patronage to its networks, producing almost zero content of any value, especially in recent years. And it's my belief that tearing down those ineffective, weak institutions and highlighting the role of, let's say, private-led initiatives like Azad, working in a much more efficient and effective manner, is probably the future of Iran itself, if not the future of the Islamic Republic. And so I wanted to highlight the role of Azad. I highly encourage anyone who speaks Persian and who wants to follow Iranian affairs to watch them, watch their debates, and hopefully, like other attempts to set up these types of organizations and institutions in the past, they can continue their work and to continue to push the boundaries of freedom of speech, of debate inside of Iran, to push for transformation or even comprehensive change in the country. Thank you very much, and hope to be out with more content soon. Thank you.